So Christiana just said, told you some of what she's been able to do on the defensive. Just think about what she could do on the offensive. We get some more legislation passed around the country. Christiana and ADF are doing an amazing job, as are each of you in this room, and it's truly an honor to be with you fighting for this great cause, the cause of objective truth and human rights for women. I'd like to share with you some of the lessons from anti-doping that can, and let me just see how I can get this to work, that can and I believe must inform the right to a level playing field in women's sport. But before I do that, I must briefly respond to a comment from Ross Tucker. I'm not sure if Dr. Tucker is here at the moment. He said that he hoped it was the last time that he and Emma give that presentation. And I think I need to share the view, probably of all of us here in this room, that until the protection of the women's category is secured once and for all, you need to be back here every year giving that presentation. Second, I'd like to start from the point in my presentation made in Ross's presentation, that the idea in the IOC guidelines that sport eligibility discussions must start, quote, with no presumption of retained male advantage, end quote, is scientifically wrong. And I'd like to carry that argument forward and show why that presumption must be ethically and legally wrong, as it is contrary to the rationale that underlies the world anti-doping system, a system already in place in terms of legal protections in sport for a level playing field. To that end, I posit that the strongest reasons for protecting a level playing field in women's sport are ethical reasons. And we must speak of the issue of males competing in the female category as an ethical matter, upon which the well-being of sport, children, women, and men depends. Now, I know what you're thinking. He's a lawyer. He's not qualified to speak on ethics. So, quite honestly, I don't feel qualified to speak on ethics. But I have heard a lot of lies in my career. And one thing I've learned over and over and over again is that a situation is never made better by telling a lie. The truth is always the best policy, and telling someone a lie in a compassionate way is not compassionate. Now, those are very simple concepts, I know, but don't they speak to the heart of what's happening today in some sports? A boy is not a girl, a man is not a woman, and males competing in the female category of sport undermines the primary ethical rationale for competitive sport because it's objectively not fair. Women's sport has become the battleground for the soul of sport in America and around the world. The eligibility crisis in women's sport is where truth is more contested, more at stake than any other area of sport. So how do we win this battle? Science is important. So is education and activism. But I submit that most important is ethics. Because when you are standing on what you know to be true and upon your ethics, your values, you'll stand. And that's what is needed now, people who will stand. Critics say we cannot defend the women's category in ethical terms. That is too divisive. We cannot tell people they're wrong. It's not sufficiently compassionate. And I respectfully disagree. We've been telling people it's wrong to use drugs in sport for decades. It's time we applied the same ethical standards regarding performance enhancement for competition, fair competition, a level playing field, relied on in anti-doping, to protect women against trans cheating. In the global anti-doping system run by the World Anti-Doping Agency, known as WADA, has been discussed, a drug is placed on the prohibited list if there is any possibility of performance enhancement. Not every performance-enhancing drug, or PED, works equally on every athlete, and some don't work at all on some athletes. Some individuals are non-responders. But the rule is, if any trace of a banned drug is found in the athlete's sample, the athlete is liable. There's no individual assessment to see if that athlete got an advantage. Individual assessment would render the global anti-doping system unworkable. Yet when it comes to the participation of a man in the women's category, we are told that the man must be individually assessed to see if that particular man has a performance advantage over women. I've been in plenty of anti-doping hearings in which the athlete tries to argue that the drug in his system or her system did not enhance performance. And these arguments are simply not considered regarding liability for a rule violation. What ethical standard makes no individual assessment of performance enhancement ethical in an anti-doping case, but requires individual assessment in the case of a man who wants to compete in women's sport? The next slide references WADA's inclusion of tramadol on the prohibited list and shows a study of a group of time trial cyclists demonstrating a modest 1.3% average faster time correlated to tramadol use. This study was then generalized across all sports to put tramadol on the prohibited list. It was not required to be shown that tramadol is performance enhancing in all sports or in all people. Being male gives a sport performance advantage to men over women. And the scientific evidence for the performance enhancement of being male is more robust than the scientific evidence by which any specific drug is currently on the WADA prohibited list. Indeed, drugs are regularly put on the prohibited list with far less scientific evidence than we've seen in this room over the last 2 days. Far less evidence than we have for maleness being performance enhancing. Yet some still insist that simply being male cannot be considered a performance enhancer, that individual evidence is required to exclude a man from the women's category if the man chooses to identify as a woman. What is the basis for that insistence? It is not a science-based requirement, nor is it consistent with how other ethical decisions in sport have been made for nearly a quarter century. 24 years ago, in February 1999, the International Olympic Committee convened the first World Conference on Doping in Sport and formed WADA as an independent entity with jurisdiction over drug use in sport and with governance comprised of 1/2 from representatives of international sport and 1/2 representatives from the governments of the world. In 2003, at the second World Conference on Doping in Sport, the first World Anti-Doping Code was adopted. The code sets forth common principles concerning protection of the integrity of sport, fair competition, and a level playing field, using exactly those words. On October 9, 2005, the UNESCO International Convention Against Doping in Sport was adopted, making implementation of the World Anti-Doping Code a goal of governments worldwide. UNESCO calls the International Convention Against Doping in Sport the most successful convention in the history of UNESCO. It is now the second most ratified of all UNESCO treaties, with 191 states as parties. Thus, over the last 24 years, the world has exhibited extraordinary consensus, developing a robust international structure for pursuing integrity in sport. That 191 countries have signed on to the code demonstrates widespread international agreement on what makes sport meaningful, on the values that underlie sport, and on how to protect integrity in sport. Some of these values are summarized in the fundamental rationale for the World Anti-Doping Code, which I'll read in part. Anti-doping programs are founded on the intrinsic value of sport. This intrinsic value is often referred to as the spirit of sport, the ethical pursuit of human excellence. Anti-doping programs seek to maintain the integrity of sport in terms of respect for rules, other competitors, fair competition, a level playing field, and the value of clean sport to the world. Notice, there is no shyness here in describing in ethical and moral terms the values of protecting athlete health, fair competition, and a level playing field. These values are described as globally shared, which we know to be true because 191 countries have adopted them. Is it okay to recognize that there are certain moral absolutes that are so universal that their ubiquity is itself evidence of an external source for those values? In his book, The Abolition of Man, British scholar C.S. Lewis describes the universal moral law widely accepted across cultures as the Tao, which he found in such varied sources as the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Old Norse Velaspa, the Babylonian Hymn to Samos, the Hindu laws of Manu, and the ancient Chinese Analects of Confucius in the writings of Cicero from ancient Rome, and in Islamic, Jewish, and Christian texts, demonstrating its universality. Perhaps recognition that there has come an emergence of a worldview that says there are no absolutes. I will define myself, and I can decide what others must give me through my power to demand and to threaten and to coerce, will drive us back to a worldview based on universally shared ethical standards, such as found in the codes: respect for rules, other competitors, fair competition, a level playing field, and the value of clean sport to the world. The code's universal adoption and acceptance tells us there is widespread agreement that the value of sport to society depends on integrity and ethical values, and it tells us to have ethical sport, we must protect the health of athletes, and that includes not putting them in a situation where they are induced to use PEDs to keep up. Friends, science provides data necessary to detect doping, but science is not what motivates the global anti-doping effort. For 24 years, the world has been fighting drugs in sport, and the fight has unstintingly been described in ethical terms. Shared ethics, common commitment to universal principles, gives the global anti-doping effort the potential to succeed. Likewise, shared commitment to universal ethical principles is the key to protecting the women's category of sport. But with respect to males in the female category, there has been an unmistakable shift in the ethical conversation regarding what constitutes a level playing field. A friend of mine recently sent me a tweet, probably thinking it would cause me to either laugh or cry. So here it is. Lance Armstrong dominated men's cycling by taking drugs, and we called it cheating. If Lance Armstrong took drugs to transition and dominated women's cycling, we'd call it progress. Part of the irony here is recognition that some who view using drugs to boost athletic performance as cheating do not regard it unethical when men take testosterone-generated bodies into women's sport and gain an advantage over women. Through humor, the tweet describes that what we need in sport is not so much better science, it's better ethics. It's not so much understanding what drugs are being used by who, but more basically, what is fair competition? What is a level playing field? Why do they matter? It is ethical to treat like circumstances alike. And Christiana just described how that's part of equal protection analysis too. That's a legal principle, not just an ethical one. But it's unethical not to do so when someone is harmed. To the extent it treats performance enhancement obtained through male advantage differently and less strictly than performance enhancement obtained through doping, a sport is not acting ethically. The good news, however, is that those who think it fair for men to come into women's sport and dominate simply because they have declared themselves female is rather small. You have seen, and others have talked about, this Gallup poll in which the question was asked, do you think transgender athletes should be able to play on sports teams that match their current gender identity, or should only be allowed to play on sports teams that match their birth gender? 69% said only on teams that match their birth identity. This is up from 62% in 2021, and I think that's probably the result of the work of a lot of people in this room. Only 26% think transgender athletes should be able to play on teams that match their identity. Why do nearly 70% of Americans believe transgender athletes should play on teams matching their birth sex? Americans and the world likes fair sport. Americans and the world don't like cheating, and they view males participating in female sport as cheating. In 2014, this Harris Interactive survey of 2,000 US adults found that 89% agreed more action needed to be taken to prevent the use of performance-enhancing drugs in professional sports, and 88% said more action was needed to prevent the use of PEDs at the Olympics. Americans and the world loathe unfair advantage in sport. In that survey, over 50% of adults saw doping as the greatest offense, and this of course was before the current transgender moment. They saw PEDs as the greatest offense that can be done by an Olympic athlete or team. 53% said that athletes who use PEDs are basically just criminals. Friends, yeah. Cheating is wrong, right? Friends, we will best protect the women's category of sport if we are willing to talk about what we know to be ethical and fair. Males competing in the women's category is not a winning issue with the public. Why? Because the public is made up of a bunch of ogres that do not want people with gender dysphoria to be happier? No. It's for the same reason that 191 countries have signed onto a code that says cheating is wrong because it undermines fair competition and a level playing field. We share common ethical values that underpin our understanding of true sport. And if a sports administrator chooses not to implement those widely shared values, they are not putting their sport on a path for success with the public. Why is the public so sensitive to cheating in sport? One reason is that there's more than a 50-year history of PEDs in sport. It's very clear to sports fans what steroids do. Doping females, as this slide indicates, with a male sex steroid turned an impoverished country smaller than the state of Tennessee into an Olympic powerhouse, winning 10 of 11 individual gold medals in swimming at the 1976 Olympic Games. The effects of PEDs are most dramatic in women's sport because of the very low levels of testosterone in women, and doping of East German women showed persistent PED use provides long-lasting and, after a time, permanent performance enhancement. Another unfortunate fact about East German doping was that it took another 23 years for the IOC to bring WADA into being, and it took numerous additional scandals for that to take place. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and until the 2000s, as WADA and national anti-doping agencies came into being, the IOC outsourced anti-doping duties to sports organizations that largely lack the capacity, expertise, and in some cases, the will to do much about doping. The result? Generations of athletes who dreamed and sacrificed, but lost their podium moments to cheating. You see any parallels? In 2021, the IOC sought to sidestep another controversial issue by putting individual sports in charge of so-called transgender eligibility issues. Now, the only thing good I can say about this is that the IOC guidelines do identify as priorities in drafting these rules the key ethical standards of ensuring fair and safe competition and, quote, a level playing field where no athlete has an unfair advantage over the rest. These are the same standards found in the World Anti-Doping Code. So sports administrators ask how to avoid a legal challenge. I think it's the wrong question. As others have said, legal challenges are inevitable. For instance, in the US, if you adopt policies that allow men to compete in the women's category, a sport receiving federal funding might be sued under Title IX, depending on their connection to the government. Alternatively, a national governing body could be challenged under arbitration procedures available under the Olympic and Amateur Sports Act for, quote, not providing equitable support and encouragement for participation by women in programs that are conducted on a national basis. Given legal challenges are inevitable, the key question every governing body must ask is what is the best decision we can make for the long-term good of the athletes in our sport? As the World Anti-Doping Code demonstrates, the answer to that question will be found when a sport prioritizes safe and fair competition and a level playing field. You are here listening and online watching because you care about the future of sport. You know the importance of ethical sport to your children, to your friends, and to your own life. I have seen unethical sport up close. I've spent hours interviewing sports champions, some household names and others not, who decided to dope because they were convinced the only way they could compete in their sport was to use drugs. If males are permitted in the women's category, I wonder how many young girls will be tempted to use steroids or EPO to compete to try to level the playing field to keep up. Many cyclists quit the sport after realizing they could not compete without using drugs. By allowing boys to compete in the girls' category, how many young girls will decide not to continue in what has become unethical sport? What is a sport's duty to its athletes? I ask that question not just about female athletes. I ask it on behalf of today's transgender athletes. Some of the leading health institutions in Europe, like the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, state minors should not be encouraged to take hormones that lock themselves into irreversible physical changes. I'm going to read you a quote from the policy of the Astrid Lindgren Children's Hospital at the Karolinska Institute regarding puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for minors. Quote, "These treatments are potentially fraught with extensive and irreversible adverse consequences such as cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, infertility, increased cancer risk, and thrombosis." That's blood clots, and that can be fatal, as unfortunately a lot of young boys taking EPO and young women found out. This makes it challenging to assess the risk-benefit for the individual patient, and even more challenging for the minors or their guardians to be in a position of an informed stance regarding these treatments. So I appreciate that World Aquatics, World Athletics, and the UCI recognize the importance of a level playing field in women's elite sport, but the policies of these organizations allow men to compete in the women's category if they began puberty blockers and the use of feminizing hormones by age 12. So what of the young boys who will be incentivized by those policies to use powerful puberty blockers and perhaps even seek surgery to make life-changing physical alterations at age 12 or earlier because their sports policies say that when a child must transition to compete at the highest level is age 12 or earlier? Is this aspect of sports policy consistent with the highest ethical standards, or is it merely designed to win a court case? The slide here has sad headlines resulting from sports failing to protect their young athletes. And Jinsei talked about that earlier today. Horrors resulted when ethics were set aside, when the truth was not told. What will the headlines be 10 or 15 years from now? Will one who is just a child today be lamenting, perhaps telling Congress, or maybe just through tears to a counselor, they were encouraged to transition at age 10 or 11 so that they could become a champion runner or swimmer or cyclist? Decisions made from a strong ethical foundation have a way of working out well, but those founded in expediency do not stand the test of time. Sport operates on globally accepted ethical values. Men competing in the women's category violates those values in a sport that enforces anti-doping rules but then permits men to compete in the women's category is schizophrenic, a house divided which cannot long stand. Conversely, a sport that upholds integrity, fair competition, and ethical values is a treasure of great worth and lasting value. Ethical sport is worth fighting for. Icons women, keep fighting for it. You are in the right ethically. Therefore, I believe you will ultimately be in the right and people will recognize it legally and in sport. You will win.